I want to welcome everybody to our webinar today, sponsored by Faster Cures and Genetic Alliance. We're going to talk about sharing clinical trial data, and we're soliciting your thoughts on an IOM Framework Report. We're going to talk about what is the IOM, what is clinical trial data, why we're soliciting thoughts at this point. We'll have several presenters, and this will be co-moderated by Margaret Anderson from Faster Cures with me, Sharon Terry from Genetic Alliance. We're delighted to have this topic be presented to the broad community. I'll just give a very tiny bit of background from my perspective. We began at the Institute of Medicine looking at this topic actually many years ago. Quite a few people have looked at it over the years. And in October 2012, we had a workshop during which it became clear that while lots of people thought that clinical trial data sharing was a good idea, there really needed to be some recommendations around it. And in June of 2013, a group got together and looked at what the kind of parameters of such a group committee would be, and put together essentially an idea around what could be done in terms of recommendations. This group that has convened is being led by Bernie Lowe of the Greenwall Foundation, and Bernie will introduce this topic to us today. We'll also hear from Tim Coetzee from the National M.S. Society, and also Steve Goodman from Stanford University. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Margaret Anderson from Faster Cures.
Thank you very much. So Faster Cures is delighted to have the opportunity to co-host this webinar with you, Sharon, and Genetic Alliance. I think our two organizations really share a passion for bringing the voice of patients and patient-driven organizations into these types of debates. And so this is a great way to build education and awareness and give all of the folks on the line today and those who will hear about it afterwards the ability to comment on these challenges and opportunities and give us their perspectives about how they see sharing clinical trials data more openly in the R&D ecosystem. So with that, we will begin. Sharon, unless you have other introductory comments to make, we'll have Dr. Lowe give us a few slides.
Sure. The only thing I will say to everybody on the webinar is you'll see on your right-hand side, usually, a panel. And the panel has on it a little section that says questions. And you can type your questions there at any time. Margaret and I will be organizing those questions, and then she will read those questions out so that the speakers can answer them at the end of the presentation. So again, at any time, feel free to put your questions in there as well. All right.
So Dr. Lowe, if you want to take it away, and we'll be advancing those slides for you.
Okay, thank you. So first, I want to say I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward very much to the comments and reactions of those of you in the audience, and we, as you'll hear later, we're also soliciting written comments. And I want to thank Genetic Alliance and Faster Cures for setting this up and making it possible. I just want to say a couple of words at the onset about the topic to provide you some context. And I apologize because I know this may be very familiar to some of you, but perhaps not so familiar to others. So clinical trials are studies where an intervention is tested to determine its benefits and safety. And what we're talking about is sharing not only the results of the trials, which obviously are of great interest to the community at large and participants, but also sharing the data on which any publications may be based, and perhaps also sharing data that hasn't led to publications. And Dr. Goodman will sort of go into that idea in much more detail. If I could have the next slide, please. So the Institute of Medicine is an organization, a nonprofit organization set up to provide impartial, balanced reports, which are all peer-reviewed, and it draws on a number of experts. These studies are sponsored, and this particular study is sponsored by a variety of nonprofit and for-profit sponsors. So National Institutes of Health, FDA, Wellcome Trust at the end in the UK. And then a number of pharmaceutical companies have also joined as co-sponsors. So I think this is to just underscore that this is a very important topic, not just in the public sector and to government agencies, but also to companies who are trying to develop new treatment diseases. On the next slide, the committee represents a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of expertise. It's put together to provide balance. There are some people in the committee who you'll note as you read through clearly have a certain perspective, but the committee on the whole is meant to be balanced. And all of this, when we join, say that we're open to new ideas and evidence and arguments and persuasion, so that no one should have their mind made up and go in saying, I know what the answers already are. And many of you will know Sharon Terry from the Genetic Alliance and Tim Coetzee from the National M.S. Society, who clearly have done a lot of work from the patient advocacy, disease advocacy perspective. If I could have the next slide, please. So each IOM committee is given a charge, and we must both fulfill all points of the charge and not go beyond it. So that we were asked to talk about sharing of clinical trials data. Now, many of you know that there's other types of data that isn't feeding into a clinical trial, for instance, genomics data, which also there is a lot of discussion of sharing and how to do it. But this particular report is meant to focus on clinical trials data sharing. But obviously, we want whatever we say in our final report to not be in contradiction to what might be going on in other types of data sharing. So part of the charge is to, let's go back one, to develop guiding principles and a framework and strategies for the responsible sharing of clinical trial data. And that's really what we're asked to do in this interim report that has been issued, that's available on the web, and for which we would like comments back on. In the next slide, more particularly, we're to articulate the guiding principles. We're also to describe a set of data and data sharing activities, including type of data, providers and recipients of shared data, whether and when data are disclosed publicly without restrictions, et cetera. And Dr. Coetzee will talk about the first bullet, Dr. Goodman the second. I just want to underline this is an interim framework report to guide our deliberations and final report. In that final report, we will provide findings and recommendations, but there were no findings and recommendations consistent with our charge in this interim report. So this is an opportunity, the time is right for those of you in the audience to really let us know what your thoughts, opinions, concerns, and recommendations are. Next slide, please.
I'll just break in there 1 second, Bernie. What we will be doing is sending to all of you in the chat box a link so that you can link to the questions that the IOM is asking in case you want to write some notes while any of the presenters are presenting, and then we'll also send that to you in email so you can write your comments and questions there as well. And then during this webinar, certainly feel free to write any questions you'd like the presenters to answer now, and we are recording this so that you can watch it later.
Okay. So on the next slide is just a timeline overview of the committee process. We started, we had our first meeting in October. The next slide, please. Great. Started in October, issued the framework report for public comment January 22nd. We're now beginning of March, and so we have several more meetings, and then writing the report, and we're looking to release the report in December of this year. So our minds are not made up. We're thinking, deliberating, hearing evidence, listening to public feedback, and this will all go into the report. The next slide, please. So I just want to say that all IOM reports are peer-reviewed by a variety of people, again, from different backgrounds, to make sure that the recommendations would be supported by the evidence. There were no recommendations here, but the framework was peer-reviewed, and we do need to take into account the comments, suggestions, concerns of the reviewers. And the list of reviewers there, again, you can see the diversity of people, including someone representing the National Health Council, as well as researchers and people who are from research institutions. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tim to go over the framework we offered in the report for our first part of the charge.
Well, thank you, Bernie. It's great to be with everyone today. So I am going to take a few minutes to go through the guiding principles, as well as some of the operational considerations that we're working through. So the slide illustrates the 4 principles that we have arrived at as the initial framework, and these are that we respect the individual participants whose data is being shared, that there is an intent to maximize the benefits for all participants in clinical trials and to society while minimizing the harm, and really balancing these 2 imperatives. We reiterate a commitment to increase the public trust in clinical trials, because there's a significant need to do that. And that the 4th principle, a provisional guiding principle, is that we aim to carry out the sharing of clinical data, trial data, in a manner that enhances the fairness to everyone who is involved in this. So these are the 4 that we outline in our report, and are the guiding principles on which we're seeking your comment and feedback. On the next slide, we've also outlined some operational considerations that need to be taken into account. So if I could have the next slide, please.
Can you see that, Tim?
My computer might be acting slowly, so I'll just...
Okay, I'm on slide 10.
You're on slide 10. I'll keep going. There we go.
Okay.
Slight buffering issue here. So some operational considerations that have arisen during our work is that consideration needs to be given to the timing of when is data shared, so that as studies are completed, when and where the data is shared, having some timing around that is a consideration that we need to weigh. Another consideration is the proportionality of benefits, burdens, and risks to the various parties involved in this, including people who participate in the trials, but also the sponsors associated with it. We recognize also that there are some opportunities to embed learning in this trial data sharing system, and to something that would, I think, fit in nicely with our evolving learning health system, as we call it. And some of that are the benefits, adverse consequences, best practices, and quality improvement. And then lastly, we are aiming through our report to be as globally applicable and as practically achievable as possible, given the import of what is at stake here. And so the next slide, also identifies some other issues that we are wrestling with, and really is, as the headline says, who do the benefits of clinical trial data belong? Is there a property interest in the data, and who owns that? Is it the research institution, the funders, the individual stakeholders? And then do these benefits belong to the public, to the institutions who invest their time and resources, and really what are the implications and obligations to share data, and how do we balance these perspectives in both guiding principles and the legal requirements. These are all elements that we, as a committee, are going to need to grapple with over the next coming months, and are eager to solicit the feedback of particularly the patient advocacy community in this effort. With that, I'm going to turn the floor to Steve Goodman, who's going to discuss some of the data sharing elements and other activities associated with this. Steve?
Okay, thanks, Tim. And this is another voice on the phone. So I'll talk briefly about, in some sense, what makes this so complicated. We've talked about data sharing, but you will see quite quickly that the word data encompasses a broad range of things, and we'll give you a very, very brief introduction to that, which will give you hints as to why they had to put together a whole committee in a year to think about this. So we'll outline the conceptual framework that we're using to organize our work, and also to guide our own analysis of the benefits and risks, and also to guide the recommendations in the final report. So we go to the next slide. So this is a complicated slide, and I don't have control of the pointer, so unfortunately I can't quite point, but I'll try to guide you through it a little bit. When we say data, this slide captures all the things that data can mean. And if the slide looks complicated, that's because data is complicated. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you will see that there's a picture of raw data. That is a nurse with a patient getting the patient's blood pressure. There's also other forms of raw data. You see images there and X-rays, and then actual tubes of blood, and then there might be a case report form that has information from the patient. That's sort of direct information. This is raw data, and in general, it's not raw data that we are talking about sharing, but a highly processed form of data. It would be almost impossible, literally impossible, to share all the information that's gathered on every patient in every clinical trial. So what happens actually to this data is it goes through many, many steps, and as we go down from the upper left-hand box, you see we have this data is abstracted, and then it's coded, it's put into numbers. It might be transcribed in terms of reports. It's then in terms of like reports from a reading of an X-ray, and it's put into computerized form, and then it's cleaned. What does clean mean? Well, clean means that there's going to be missing data. There's going to be data that's entered incorrectly. There's going to be ages of 150, and there's going to be temperatures of 4, and all of this has to be straightened out before the data can be analyzed. And finally, you get to the bottom left, which is a clean, analyzable data set. And here is what we have represented by a little wall, and is where the database is locked for analysis. And on the right-hand side, we have all the kinds of analyses that can be done on this data set. And you see in the multicolor stack, we have exploratory data, we have adverse event data, we have pre-specified secondary and tertiary outcomes, and then we have participant characteristics and primary outcome. And all of these are combined and analyzed and into results that ultimately are published in part in journal articles. But what you see in a journal article is only a very, very, very tiny part of everything that was gathered and everything that was analyzed. We have in the upper part, upper right, a little box with regulators. Regulators actually see, particularly the FDA, might see a lot more than in some ways many of the investigators, a lot more than is shared with the public. And regulators, the FDA, is required to keep that confidential. And so they have data that nobody else sees except the suppliers of the data. So this gives you a sense of how complicated data is, and when we say data has to be shared, we have to be very, very, very precise about saying at what stage in the filtering and compressing of data that it does need to be shared. So now we'll go on to the next slide. So what the previous slide hopefully sensitized you to is that you can't understand what the data means in a data set without understanding how it was gathered and what every number represents. And that description of what the numbers represent and how it was gathered is called metadata. It's not the numbers themselves, but it's how the study was designed, how it was conducted, and how it was analyzed. So you see here, without metadata, it's difficult to use or interpret other data. That is, if I gave all of you just an Excel file with lots of numbers on it, you would have no idea what that meant. And even if I told you what the columns were, it still would be very difficult to analyze it. So you really need to understand what the study was measuring and how it was measured. And this is called metadata. So when we talk about sharing data, we're not just talking about sharing the kinds of things you saw on the previous page. We're talking about sharing the information that's absolutely critical to understanding what's in the data set. And those things could include the full protocol with all the amendments. It could include the manual of operations and standard operating procedures, which says how things are actually done, and could include, as I said before, the actual statistical analysis plan, that is what people plan to do, but then the actual code they use, the statistical programming, to produce the numbers and figures that were generated for the reports. Next slide. So when we talk about models of data sharing, we have to be very, very specific about the data. We have to be very, very, very specific about the metadata, so that's what's being shared. But then there are other dimensions. So this is like being a good journalist: who, what, when, where, how. So who is going to provide the shared data? Who's going to host it? It might be easy to say the investigators, but there might be an intermediary who actually hold on to the data. Who is going to get the data? Is it the entire world? Is it people who just apply with a specific proposal in mind and and a question? When might it be shared? Obviously, there are problems sharing it minutes after it was complete or before the primary publication. So when is a reasonable time to reap the benefits and not take away from the investigators the ability to extract and publish the results is a key question. And finally, how should it be shared? And there are a variety of models, and I'll just show you a few here. It's not different. Each model has a different risk and benefit to both society and individuals. So let's go to the next slide. So actually, this repeats some of what I just said. It just says each model, let me just go back. Each model has to have each of the elements that we just talked about: the type of data, provider, recipients, timing, qualifications for access, and conditions of use. So those are two other dimensions which I didn't mention. So these models we're going to talk about are conceptual categories. They're not an actual proposal, and we haven't decided exactly which model or models we'll be recommending, but this will give you a sense of the range. So this is the next and last slide I'll be talking about. Next slide, next slide. So now we're on 18. There we are. So here's four possible models for data sharing. One is totally open, just in some sort of on some sort of website. You go to the name of the trial, you press on a link, and all the files you could possibly want are there for anybody to get for any purpose. So that would be completely open access. Then is somewhat more limited access. That is that you have access limited. First of all, you might have just an individual company or that shares its data, or an individual institution, or data from an individual researcher. And as soon as you talk about controlling it, you have to talk about then, okay, who gets it. That is, who's qualified to get it, and who's to decide on those qualifications. And second is, are there conditions put on the use of that data? That is, it might be said that the data can only be used to replicate what was in the paper. That is, it might be said that it can be used to generate new results, but only with the collaboration of the additional investigators. Or it might be said that they can use it for absolutely anything they want. A third model is controlled access to pooled and multiple data sources. That is, it isn't restricted by the company, by the institution, or by a particular trial, where you just go to the investigators for that trial and say, can we have your data? But in fact, there's a pooled place where there's access to data from many, many sources. There are many examples of this already. So this allows you to maybe put together trial data that from multiple trials, or linked data, and it's a common ground. You can go to many fewer places to get data you need. And finally, there's a model of a closed partnership or consortium, which is a group of researchers, and there are many examples of this. In a particular area, it might be a disease area like infectious diseases or autoimmune diseases, where they agree to pool or make available all the data that every member of the consortium is producing to every other member of the consortium, and that may or may not be available to the outside world. But then the results are published by the original producers of the data, but again, it might be a very large group, so the pooled results might be analyzed by people different than those who generate them. So these are just examples. There are actually other models as well, but these are going to be the kinds of things we'll be thinking about along with the other dimensions that we just discussed. So I'll hand it off from there.
So Tim, I think you've got a couple more slides to go.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Steve, for that setup. So I'm just going to provide some additional setup for some of our discussion. As Bernie alluded to, the committee released a framework for discussion document in 2014 that is the basis for what we've been discussing this afternoon. And in this slide, we've identified 5 of the topics on which we would like your public feedback to help us as we embark on the second phase of the study, which will culminate ultimately in an issued report and recommendations. Among the topics that we want your input on is the issue of global impact and practical considerations. We are striving and considering, or as we think about the work here, the committee has an eye towards recognition of the fact that clinical trials and clinical trial data is now handled in a global setting, and so we want to be mindful of the consideration of having a global impact with this report, but also being practical and pragmatic, and that much needs to be considered, and pragmatism is something that we are giving voice to. Another issue on which we want your feedback is issue of timing, and how do we prioritize this? As we have embarked in our work, there has been some consideration about that. Significant investment by investigators goes into the conduct of a clinical trial, and that in some instances there's a desire for some research to be conducted prior to full release of the data. And so balancing the timing of a release, but also prioritizing which data should be released is another area that we're grappling with. And then the last 3 of finding ways to mitigate the risks, both to the participants but also to the investigators and the sponsors, is an area on which we want your feedback. And then lastly, the sort of twin issues of how do we enhance the incentives for investigators, whether academic or industry investigators, to release data, and also how do we effectively measure the impact of having clinical trial data sharing. These are among the 5 issues that we want to hear from you today as to what should we be considering as a committee, and what should we be weighing both as we do our work, but also during our public meetings. The next slide also provides you some places where you can online where you can provide feedback. So there's a website web address where you can submit comments to the committee for our consideration as we do our work. And so, Margaret, I want to hand it back to you to facilitate our dialogue.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for really terrific presentations. I think just to go back.
This is Bernie. Could I just add one thing before you?
Absolutely. Please do.
Slide that Tim mentioned. That website also is a place where anyone can download the report. It's a PDF that's easily downloadable, so you can read it at your leisure, and as Tim said, provide comments over the web. Thank you.
Absolutely. So to go back to the beginning, we talked for a moment about this being an Institute of Medicine study. I thought it would be worth a note to say, for folks who maybe hadn't heard of the IOM before, or you weren't aware of the role that they play, the IOM was founded in 1970, but it is part of the National Academies of Science, which has been around since 1863, and that was chartered under President Lincoln. And as was stated by Bernie, it's a very nonpartisan way to aggregate information. So for those of you who aren't aware of the work of IOM, I do encourage you to take a look at the IOM website in addition to this study. There's many places you can sign up to get information and many opportunities for feedback into those studies. So let's go to some of the questions that people have been putting through to us. So the first I'll start with is, what are the plans to protect patient privacy and confidentiality? And would data shared be de-identified or identifiable or anonymized? So I'm not sure which person would like to take that question.
Tim, do you want to take it, or do you want me to take it?
Well, it sounds like Steve was going to take it.
I'll take it. Go for it.
I'll just say a few words, but then I'm sure there's plenty of space for additional comment. That is one of the central things that we're going to be thinking about, is exactly when we talk about risks and benefits, one of the risks is potentially to patient confidentiality and privacy, and one of the benefits of data sharing is to allow new knowledge to be created and quote-unquote old knowledge to be validated. And sometimes when you de-identify, the information becomes less useful because you have to remove so much information. But that said, for the most part, we are talking about de-identified information, but how much it's de-identified and whether that undermines the utility of the data sharing is a big question in specific cases. So that is exactly one of the difficult balancing acts that we are confronting. The default basically is that any data that is shared with outside investigators, certainly with the public, would indeed be de-identified. But exactly the processes and who would do that and how complete the de-identification would be and whether it would threaten the very value of the sharing are all complicated questions. So Bernie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so just to add a few things to that very good response. One issue that we are planning to deliberate on is whether the current standards for de-identification, such as the HIPAA de-identification safe harbor, really serves, is appropriate enough to really protect the privacy and confidentiality of subjects. And the other issue we're going to be looking at is what sort of safeguards with regard to security and data usage should be put into any data use agreements that people who share or users of data who obtain data from other sources to use for further work. what protections could be built into that as a condition of having access.
Any other discussion on that question? Okay. Another question is, would it be conceivable to develop a template-informed consent form that would be usable by all sponsors, research institutes, to enable data sharing in an ethical way?
Tim, do you want to?
Well, I think, so this is Tim, I do think that is, again, one of the, as Steve alluded to and Bernie alluded to, one of the challenges that we will face. I think the answer, I think ultimately one we will hope that is something that we could achieve. I think, as I alluded to in my remarks, considering this globally and considering what informed consent means internationally and globally to patients in the U.S. versus other countries is another aspect to this. I think ultimately, certainly it would be desirable to have one informed consent that could be used uniformly, but I think there likely will also be a recognition that this may need to be adaptable depending on where the trial is occurring, and there are, as we've discussed in some of our meetings, some of the cultural issues that need to be considered in this. So ultimately, I think that would be our hope, but we also want to balance pragmatism with that.
May I add one other comment to what Tim said, which I totally agree with?
Please do.
In addition to the question, I think really is talking about looking forward to the future. In future clinical trials, when people are enrolling as participants, can we address informed consent? Can we address data sharing as part of the informed consent process? There's also a backward-looking component that we want that we will be thinking about. There are a lot of clinical trials that have just been completed, or even older clinical trials, where there may be value in sharing that data with other researchers, for example. One of the things Dr. Goodman mentioned is that there's so much data collected that a fair amount of it has not yet been analyzed and published, and there's real value perhaps to be gained in that. But we would definitely want any sharing to be consistent with the consent that the participants gave on enrollment in the trial. In our last meeting in February, we heard from people who had looked at consent forms from completed clinical trials, and there's enormous variation as to whether the whether the consent process even mentioned data sharing. The provisions for it were extremely variable, not to mention how IRBs construe this often ambiguous language, and sometimes there is nothing at all in the consent form. So what should the policy for sharing in ways that are consistent with the choices that people made when they enrolled in the trials? That's another issue we'll be looking at.
In terms of, we have received another question which is addressing the issue of what are the incentives to sharing, and would there be sanctions if a sponsor or a study institute didn't share? And this person wrote in, that they feel there are cases where researchers are not sharing data, particularly negative data, and this results in other investigators repeating the same experiment without an idea that there was something else already done, which also puts an additional burden on patients and an additional risk and cost. Can anyone speak to this issue of what would the incentives be to sharing, and then perhaps how would it be sort of controlled?
So I do think, the questioner has put their issue on certainly something that funders of research and I think sponsors also grapple with, and I think the notion of I think at least in our mind the the development of guidelines like this is and creating a framework for this kind of trial data sharing is what is needed in many respects to lower the barrier to to creating a framework by which, say, negative clinical trial data can be shared. I think this is a part of the conversation about not just publishing positive trials that had a positive outcome, but trials that had a negative outcome, and creating a framework for both generating new knowledge and also perhaps creating some understanding as to why a particular failure occurred. So I think that is part of why, an implicit part of why we're creating this framework, because that may be happening too often, and there's a clear desire certainly to try to shift that. But I think also this is where I would urge that pragmatism will continue to be part of this, because incentives do need to be created for both the deposition of the data, but also, as Steve alluded to in this, Dr. Goodman alluded to in his comments, it's not just the data, but everything that goes with the data in order for one to be able to have an informed study. And so I think part of that is those are some of the issues that we will probably be grappling with.
Let me add to Tim's comments. This is Steve Goodman. The obvious and most powerful incentive or disincentive, depending on how you look at it, would be a requirement by funders to deposit data in some sort of repository or on some platform that facilitated sharing. Right now, the NIH has for trials over $500,000, you have to file a data sharing plan, but there's no specifics as to what that plan has to be or what conditions it has to meet. So it's actually not necessarily in any way a requirement that people share their data. So ultimately, it's going to be the decisions of funders, perhaps in concert with a lot of the rest of the research community, journals, other investigators, either requiring or demanding that trial data be shared. And again, part of our challenge is to try to figure out what structures can be set up so that can be done in a way that's both effective but also fair to everyone involved. So ultimately, it's going to have to be entities like that provide the push to do it. There are situations in which researchers get together and they recognize a collective benefit to science and to the patients themselves to sharing their data. And then that's a very, very positive incentive. And hopefully, as we go to a new era where it becomes more the norm for data to be shared, the incentive will be that everybody gets to share in the new cornucopia of released and open clinical and shareable clinical trial data, and that everybody benefits, both the patients and also the scientists, from that situation. We're not quite there yet, and getting over this divide will require coordinated efforts of many entities. I would say one last thing is that we've also explored is if scientists were able to get academic credit for the use of their data when it was shared, that would be a very strong incentive for them to share their data. Right now, to the extent that academic promotion and things like that is governed by publications, sometimes sharing data is seen as a threat to how many papers you can publish from a given data set. But if they got equal credit for someone else using the data that they generated, that would be a very powerful incentive. So we're looking at professional academic incentives as well as from funders, and it's a very complex mix, but it's an extremely good question.
So another comment. Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just quickly underscore a couple of things. That's a very rich question. I just want to underscore two other issues that we are going to be considering. One is the contributions of participants. People who volunteer to be in a clinical trial take on inconvenience, spend time, and often undergo medical physical risks. And to the extent that we maximize their contributions to to knowledge that leads to better treatments. That's something we suggested in the preliminary report should be a goal. And as the questioner said, if negative data aren't shared and published and people, then other participants undergo those risks and inconvenience when the question, in a sense, has already been answered, that's really not respectful to the participants and what they're doing. The other thing the questioner mentioned is sanctions, and I think we've heard in our public meetings that even simple things like the requirement to post the results of a clinical trial on a website called clinicaltrials.gov, compliance is well short of 100%. But what are the consequences of that? So if someone doesn't, an investigator doesn't fulfill the sort of the implicit or explicit agreement to share data, what are the consequences that are negative? Dr. Goodman talked about the positive incentives. I just want to emphasize to everyone on the call that what Dr. Goodman, Dr. Coetzee, and I have been saying should not be taken as sort of a direction the committee is going, or even necessarily what we as individuals think. But we're trying to respond to your questions by telling you some of the issues that have been raised to us during the public meetings, and also to say that we really are open to your suggestions on these and other comments, other topics.
Thank you. So another comment that's come in relates to the cost of doing this, and it reads, it will be extremely difficult for sponsors to implement de-identification, costly and time-consuming, if at all feasible, for all trials, and this is based on this person's experience in industry. Has that been a topic of discussion with the committee, is the cost implications to this?
Well, simple answer is yes. We heard from a number of investigators in workshops, and we know just from our own experience exactly that point. And if funders are going to require this or request it, it's very, very clear that they have to include a willingness to fund it. How much funding it would require in some ways depends on the kinds of platforms that might be set up. And right now it's quite expensive to do some of these things because everybody's sort of doing it one-off, inventing the processes by themselves, hosting their own data or paying for it to be hosted. And what we're trying to do is, as we think of possible recommendations, is thinking about things that could lower the cost both to funders and to the investigators of preparing and making the data available in this way. But it's very, very clear that there are resource implications for doing this, and we're not unaware of those.
Yeah, and to add to the response, and there needs, we've been hearing that we need to think about distributing the cost of data sharing in a fair manner between those who sponsor the data, the investigators who sponsors, say, investigators who carry out the trial, and others who wish to use the data. To what extent should the users of shared data bear some of the burden of the cost? And then there's a public role for government in terms of what's a equitable contribution for the government to make. So these are all issues we'll be definitely dealing with.
So another question is, would the data sharing require specific informed consent if individual data were anonymized through the techniques referred to in the report, which would preclude any possibility to get back to the patient?
These are very good questions. I think that's going to be continued discussion in the committee. One thing we have learned is that one can never say, anonymous of saying it's literally impossible to trace back to every patient or any patient, probably we can never offer that degree of certainty. So what the implications of that for informed consent are, is something we're going to have to talk about. But I'm sure Bernie has more to say on this.
I think it's an issue, and let me just say that as we pointed out in the report, under current federal guidelines for protection of human subjects, working with anonymized data, with that, whatever in quotes, and the definitions vary a little whether you're reading the CFR 45 CFR 46 or the HIPAA regulations, but that's not considered, once it's de-identified, anonymized, technically you don't really need, you may do the project without consent. And we raised the question, although even if it's legally possible, is that really respectful for patients to participants if they don't understand that's part of what's going to happen when they agree to be a participant. So these are all very good, very tough questions, and we are going to be addressing them. And we hope that those of you who think about this and have suggestions for us will be generous with sharing their thoughts with us.
So perhaps we have time for one last question, and that is, rare disorder clinical trial conduct and data sharing will pose particular capacity design and cost challenges. How are these issues going to be incorporated into the framework? Or maybe another take on it is, how has the discussion been around that particular issue?
So Margaret, so this is in the context of clinical trials for rare diseases and the very small populations that they have, if I interpret that question?
That's how I interpret it as well.
You know, and I think, and certainly I think Dr. Goodman and Lowe would elaborate, I think, you know, whether it's a large, a trial, a large trial in a common disease versus a rare disorder, I think, the intent is to develop principles that can be applied, across indications so that we can have as broad an impact as possible. I think recognizing that there might be unique elements within the rare disease space, and certainly I think there could be practical implications that rare diseases may have small numbers of patients and could, particularly globally, issues of de-identification, and particularly when you have small, very rare populations, is I think going to be an area of some sensitivity. So I think I think the desire is to be as pragmatic and inclusive as possible with our guidelines. But we certainly, I think, would encourage individuals who have who have thoughts on handling of data with rare diseases to certainly provide us with their thoughts and comments.
Terrific. So I think now we are finished with our questions. I know that, Sharon, you'll have a few other thoughts. I just wanted to make a quick note about an upcoming webinar Faster Tours is hosting on March the 26th at 1 o'clock Eastern. It will be to learn how the Sage Bio Networks and DREAM are doing a crowdsourcing solution approach to complex biomedical questions. So, folks can take a look at that. Sharon, back at you.
Yes, thanks very much, everyone. And you can see on your screen the upcoming webinar that Margaret just spoke about, and then also another upcoming webinar by Genetic Alliance on Tuesday, April 8th on public health genomics in practice, state strategies for preventing heritable cancer and cardiovascular syndromes. I want to thank our presenters and Margaret for giving us a robust webinar today. To remind everyone, we did record this and we will post it as soon as we process it. So you'll be able to see the slides and listen to the audio. We will also send out the link to the comments place so that you can make comments. We want to really encourage all of you to comment. It is really important to have your voices. The last question about rare diseases is certainly one that's near and dear to my heart as I sit on the committee. We need the voices of people with rare diseases, common diseases, chronic conditions, people who have participated in clinical trials, people who have never participated. We need industry, we need academia, we need advocacy, we need policy groups, etc. So we're really excited to be able to put all of this together. But again, we need your voices to make this really fly, and we will take all of this into consideration. I think you heard that from my colleagues. And once again, thanks to Margaret and Faster Cures for co-hosting this with us. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.